Well, it's a pleasure to interview you again, Andrew. You're always very incisive and insightful, and I look forward to this conversation for a while. Your new book is entitled Radical Regeneration. So let's begin very simply by having you tell us what you think needs regenerating at this point.
Everything needs regenerating. Our society is clearly failing, and we are now going through what many evolutionary mystics recognize as a global dark night process. There are 5 major crises all exploding at the same time with unprecedented intensity and danger. We have a coronavirus epidemic that is clearly out of control, with all sorts of new variants appearing, which are extremely lethal. We have a climate in collapse. We're given 10 years by the UN to make major structural changes on every level to even begin to meet the lethal dangers of that collapse. We have a worldwide crisis of inequality between the very rich, who are getting even richer, and the poor, who are getting even poorer, in an explosion of bottom line fundamentalist capitalism. We have a growth of authoritarianism, fascism, all over the world. In the Philippines, in Hungary, now in Burma, Myanmar, in Russia, and in China, and of course, in the United States. We're speaking on the day when the president is being impeached for the second time and is likely to get off and not to be held to account, which will set all kinds of terrifying precedents and could very well herald the death throes of our cherished democracy. And fifthly, we are in a crisis of the soul of humanity. I would refer people to Paul Levy's great work, Dispelling Wetiko, in which he explains in incisive and gloriously dense and intense detail the full effects of Wetiko, a soul sickness that has gripped us and made us narcissistic, entitled, self-absorbed beyond imagining, deeply apathetic in the face of danger, paralyzed by what we are beginning to glimpse, and committed in secret subconscious places to what is a life-denying and nihilistic vision of the world, which of course in its own way feeds all the other crises and makes the explosion of a fascist solution to our problems even more likely. And when you bring all of those crises together and allow yourself not just to approach them intellectually, but to feel in the guts of your being how absolutely terrifying they are, you realize that unless we truly take in where we are, unless we truly have the guts to see clearly where we are, we will not be able to meet the challenge of this dark night process, and we will not be able to align with its secret mystical laws, and we will not be able to do what I believe we still can do, which is to allow this tragic, terrible, deconstructing, savage burning down of all of our illusions to become a massive, extraordinary, transformative, regenerative opportunity to do 3 things. To align ourselves at the deepest imaginable level with what all the great mystical traditions and what the theosophists celebrate, which is our essential divine nature, which we have to uncover through a much deeper commitment to radical mystical practice. That is the first thing. The second thing, and this is thrilling to me, so if you find me getting very excited about this, I don't want to apologize, because it is the single most profound revelation of my life, and also I have discovered over the years of all of the great mystical traditions. And this is that discovering and uncovering our divine nature is also discovering and uncovering the divine plan, which is not simply to awaken us to divine consciousness, but also to awaken us to the dynamic evolutionary impulse of that divine consciousness and its secret hunger to birth in us the full embodied divine human. This is the testimony of the great Shaivite mystics. This is the witness of the great Vajrayana mystics. This is the secret burning core of Capitalism. This is what Rumi and Shams discovered in their ecstasy. This is what Jesus exemplified in his life and in the great crucifixion resurrection dance of his vast contribution. And this is what my great teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, was living at the end of his life, nothing less than the transfiguration process, this birth of a new kind of human being. And this is, of course, the core of the greatest evolutionary philosopher humanity has ever had, the core of the writings and the life of Sri Aurobindo and the woman, the extraordinary woman who followed on with his work, the mother. The third great possibility that has been revealed to me and is at the core of my work is what I've called sacred activism. The immense energy of transformative power that is unleashed when you dare to bring together the deepest mystical understanding of sacred reality and the interconnectedness of everything with a radical, urgent, guided, spiritually inspired commitment to justice on every level. When you bring together the two noblest fires of the human soul, the passion for God and the passion for justice, a third fire is born, which Teilhard de Chardin describes in the following way. Someday, after we have mastered the tides and gravity, we shall harness the energies of love. And then for the second time in the history of humanity, humanity will have discovered fire. So if you bring together these three tremendous powers, the power and the dignity and the passion and the compassion and the sheer passion energy that is released when you discover your divine nature, the power that is unleashed when you go further and discover the dynamic evolutionary will of the Godhead to birth a new divine humanity, with the power that is unleashed, and we've seen it unleashed in the 20th century in Gandhi and in Martin Luther King, and of course in our time in the Dalai Lama and Jane Goodall and magnificent beings like Mandela, the power of sacred activism, the power of this marriage of the deepest, most universal spirituality with guided, urgent, wise action on behalf of justice for all beings. When you bring together these powers, you begin to see something completely astounding. And what you see is what this book is dedicated to helping you realize. What you see is that this terrifying global dark night is not potentially the burial ground of humanity. It is potentially the birthing ground of a new, renewed, regenerated, infinitely more compassionate and infinitely more harmonious and just divine humanity. And what I have discovered through the depths of my own experience, because I went through a terrifying and comprehensive dark night experience, which ended not only in the discovery of this divine consciousness, but in the discovery of evolutionary possibility. What you discover if you plunge into the great mystics of the dark night, such as John of the Cross, such as Rumi, such as Teresa of Avila, such as Junaid of Baghdad, one of the great Sufi masters, what you discover is that what is already known in the mystical systems is that a devastating dark night process is necessary for this tremendous birth to take place. And in that discovery lies the challenge of this book, Radical Regeneration, which I wrote with Carolyn Baker. The challenge is to hold at this unprecedented evolutionary moment two very extreme opposites, the most extreme opposites we've ever been invited to hold as the human race. On the one hand, the possibility, even likelihood, of our extinction and the extinction of a great deal of nature if we continue in our mad hubris and in our absolute addiction to power over nature and in our bottom line semi-fascistic capitalism and in our dissociated spirituality. And on the other hand, this extraordinary sun of regenerative possibility that is rising in the evolutionary mystics' testimony to the potential birth of a new species out of a massive dark night. That's what we are being challenged to hold together. And the only way you can hold it is also something that the book makes absolutely clear. The only way you can hold it is in truly devoting yourself to expand your divine consciousness, which is both light and dark, which is like the consciousness of the great dancer, the Shiva's dance. The serenity and spaciousness of that consciousness will give you the ability to hold these two extreme opposites, to hang on the cross of those extreme opposites, so that the mystery of a fusion of the wisdom of the serpent and the innocence of the dove can be born in us, which can guide us forward to do the great evolutionary work of regeneration.
Well, that's very powerful and very comprehensive, because you really took us from the current situation to at least what the potential future could be. I think for many people watching this, the most important question is going to be, granted all of this is going on, and granted, as you say, things look terrible from many perspectives. And a lot of people are just simply saying, given the size of this problem, what can I do? What actions can I take specifically?
That isn't the real question. That is absolutely not the first question.
Okay.
And I want to make that as clear as I possibly can.
Okay.
It's a natural human response,
Yes.
facing all these exploding crises, to go to the usual Western cry, what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
That's not the first question. The first question is, who must I become to have the strength, the passion, the energy, the peace, the wisdom to do anything really effective in a situation as extreme as this? The first question must always be, what must I be in order to do what is now necessary in this exploding horror? And that is what we devoted the whole last part of our book to. Because what is clear to me, and I'm sure it's clear to you, Richard, because I know you and how incisive your mind is that in our present state, the current spiritual movement, the so-called New Age movement, is utterly bankrupt of solutions because it is massively dissociated from the reality of the shadow. And any movement that denies evil in a time when evil is having an orgy everywhere, and any movement that denies the sacred importance of the shadow, when the shadow of every kind is having an orgy everywhere, is doomed to triviality and dissociation, and actually feeds the problem instead of confronting it. So once you have realized that you are in a dark night process, then the question arises, what is this process? And as you know, in my book, we have analyzed that process very clearly to give everybody exactly what happens in a dark night process. And what happens in a dark night process is expressed unforgettably in the great hadith that the Prophet received from God, in which Allah says, when you are sincere, I will kill you personally. And because I'm killing you personally, I will myself pay the blood money, and what I will give you is myself. Those words are thunder and lightning from the Godhead about the great truth hidden at the core of the dark night process, which is that it is a process in which all of the structures, inner and outer, of the full self, your own full self and the full self of humanity, are systematically, precisely, ruthlessly seared down, burnt down, shattered. And what results from that are 5 kinds of very painful realizations through, firstly, total chaos, which drives you crazy. Secondly, plunging you into fundamental anxiety, anxiety beyond endurance. Thirdly, revealing to you your complete helplessness given the depths of what's happening. Fourthly, revealing to you that all the solutions that you create out of your current consciousness, however awake and intelligent, are not going to work in this situation, because this situation is exploding far beyond the possibility of those solutions to have any possibility of working. And fifthly, and this is very important, in the dark night process, the classical dark night process known by the shamans, known at the core of all of the great mystical traditions, but especially explored by the Christian and Islamic mystics, what is known is that the dark night process rips off the mask of evil and makes you terrifyingly alert, not only to the evil of the forces that are already doing their terrible work in the world, and we have to call it evil, but also to the presence of what St. Paul calls the powers and principalities, the forces in the one itself, that are there for alchemical evolutionary purposes, but are allowed to do their terrible dance and use people who've made themselves vulnerable through greed and ignorance to their power. So that's the first thing that you need to do, to get with that. And getting with that is essential, because just knowing that the dark night process has those 5 laws and structures is itself a source of beginning calm. You realize this is the situation, this is how it's going to go. I can't know exactly how it's going to go, but if it is, and it is a dark night process, it is going to follow these terrifying and grand and majestic laws. Then, what you need to understand at a radical level is that this terrifying process is actually a birthing process. Because as all the greatest mystics know of all the traditions, what this terrifying process, if you can hang in there with it, will birth in you is a level of divine expansion and divine knowledge and divine wisdom and divine passion and divine compassion and indomitable divine energy that simply couldn't be installed in you before you had been systematically unmade by the dark night. And then you need to look at those five laws of the dark night, and see that each one of them contains the seed of their transfiguring opposite. We'll take just two. The extreme chaos that the dark night thrives on and makes essential is also potentially the birthing ground of a much greater, much radiant, more radiant, much juster order. In science and in the psyche and in many processes of nature, we know now, and in many processes of quantum physics, we know that extreme disorder does not mean necessarily disaster. It means that a massive new energy is entering, creating disorder so as to birth a new reality from it. And an analogy would be the process by which a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. A caterpillar spins a cocoon, and as you very well know, it dissolves totally in that cocoon, which cannot be a pleasant experience for the caterpillar. But in the gray soup of its dissolution, wake up imaginal cells, which by a mystery of attraction come together to form within the chrysalis the quantum shift of the body of the butterfly, which then breaks free and flies off. So once you see that that's what's potentially going on, you can begin to align yourself with your future butterfly self through mystical practice and through your actions, so that you can become a co-conspirator, a collaborator, a co-creator of this great birth that is emerging from this great chaos. And the second one that I'd like to take and really look at, because we're living it right now in this country, is the ripping off of the masks of evil. We can see this in three main ways in our current situation. We can see it obviously in the Republican Party's total slavery to conspiracy theories and QAnon and the base and Trump's lies and the unspeakable desecration that that whole system has created. We can see it in the amazing expose that Shoshana Zuboff has made in Surveillance Capitalism of how all-powerful social media totally lacks morality and conscience, exploits our data, and doesn't mind spreading whole conspiracy theories and downright lies, giving them the horrible possibility of being born. We can see the darkness at the core of Facebook and others. It's clear now that that has been taken over in ways that deeply menace the divine image in the human. And if anyone listening thinks this is excessive, read Shoshana Zuboff's great book, Surveillance Capitalism, and read her completely astounding article in the Sunday Times on the knowledge coup, C-O-U-P, it will make your head rotate like Sybil in The Exorcist, but it is necessary for you to get real about what's happening. And the third great explosion of darkness is in the artificial intelligence enterprise, which purports to be beneficent, but actually has behind it a plan to have totally efficient robots be the workforce, because they will never organize into unions since they'll be controlled by us, and they will not need feeding or special rights or anything like democracy. They will just do the will of an elite. And this plan has been uncovered by major writers such as Bill McKibben. And fundamentally, it's a plan for a very rich, very powerful billionaire elite to have a whole brilliant army of artificially stoked up robots and basically a totally reduced slave class humanity, which is so vulnerable and so deprived of rights that it will do anything that it's told simply to survive. And again, if you think this is excessive, what I'm saying, please, please read Bill McKibben and the other absolutely brave and amazing beings who've uncovered this, and who've uncovered this in the words of the very people who are spearheading this adventure. Now, that's terrifying, isn't it? But, if you really have the courage to see how advanced this evil is and to see it nakedly, and the even greater courage to confront the dark forces, the powers and principalities in the one. And I had to do this during my dark night because I was personally, and so was my husband, assailed by these dark forces. They appeared, the ferocious lights, the terrifying situations. And it was only through being saved, literally, by an appearance of the Virgin to a Greek exorcist monk in the middle of Meteora that we were allowed to live. So I have confronted these and nearly died from confronting these in my own life. And they are now operating everywhere. And again, if you don't believe me, read the great book by Charles Upton on the Antichrist energies, which will make it absolutely clear for you in the highest mystical terms and also in the living experience that we're now going through. But what I have discovered in the core of my own life, and what I've discovered in the core of the great mystical traditions, that when you see this darkness as it really is, you either collapse into paralysis and despair and hopelessness, or you go so deep into the mystical fire core at the core of your being, where grace will meet you and show you that the antidote to evil is not goodness. It's living a full-on, fully committed, fully emblazoned, sacred life, attuned to the fundamental laws of the light, attuned to the fundamental laws of the great evolutionary birth, and attuned to the fundamental laws of putting love into action. So the very evil that you don't want to face and have to face and threatens you with paralysis and despair turns out to be, through divine paradox, the incisive and devastatingly passionate call to you to divinize yourself through grace and become someone who in the darkness blazes with the power and the passion and the clarity and the commitment to sacred action of the light. We need to cultivate that passion force, that clarity, that divine initiation at the deepest level, align ourselves with the truth of the great evolutionary mystics, from the shamans to Sri Aurobindo, and get going. because time is running out. One last thing, Richard, and I know you know this, but it's so important for people to understand this. This kind of devastating evolutionary process is known in nature. What Stephen Jay Gould and other great evolutionary scientists uncovered was that evolution doesn't proceed in sweet, natural gradations. It doesn't. We would like it to. That would be much more comfortable to our over-comfortable ways of looking at the world, but it doesn't work like that. What happens in nature is that species at a certain moment go through what is to them an intolerable crisis, and it's meant to be intolerable because its very intensity is what compels, forces the adaptation that enables them to survive and even transfigure. An example would be the fish that hundreds of millions of years ago left the toxic sea that was killing them, jumped onto the burning sand. Many thousands of them must have died, but some of them struggled with their fullest intensity and were able to grow organs that could adapt to the new dimension. And these fish eventually became, guess what? Birds. Just as the caterpillar is transformed into the butterfly, the fish were transformed into birds. And what I believe is that we're in a crisis, which is a crisis not just of transformation, that's too small, but of mutation, in which one kind of human species will be incinerated, but not to end the human adventure, to mutate the human being into the next level of our evolutionary destiny and possibility. And again, this is where Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's work and Satprem's work are so central, because these were beings who knew this mutation was taking place because it was taking place in them. And they charted it and they gave it that. So what we must be are evolutionary adventurers, grounded in our divine essence and grounded in the great vision of evolutionary possibility that the greatest of all prophets and mystics have given their lives to give us for this moment. And if we can do that, and we have no other option at this moment, if you see the situation clearly, then the doing that emanates from our regenerated being will be mysteriously blessed by the evolutionary will of the divine and capable in even very extreme situations of opening doors miraculously in what hitherto looked like completely doorless, windowless steel walls. Just this morning, I translated an extraordinary paragraph from one of the greatest of all Christian mystics, Hadovich of Antwerp, and I'm finishing a book on her because she is one of the great evolutionary pioneers of humanity, and I'm longing to get her work out. But just this morning, I translated a very strange passage that she wrote on the resurrection. And she says about the resurrection that the power of Jesus's name before the crucifixion was, of course, great because he was the incarnation of the Christ consciousness. But through the resurrection and through that massive act of dying and being reborn into the next level of human destiny and human evolution, the powers of the name multiplied like the loaves multiplied in the miracle of the loaves when a few loaves were suddenly found to be enough to feed 5,000 people. That's the truth about this new quantum level of regenerative power that is being offered to us if only we can align with it. That if we can align with it, the powers that will stream through us will be multiplied. And this is what the alchemists said would happen when a being became the Philosopher's Stone, which is another way of saying the embodied divine human. The powers that are then possible to that embodied divine human are quantum multiplications of the powers that were inherent before that great transfiguration had taken place. So, what do you want to do? First, join the transfiguration stream of the great evolutionary mystics. Be empowered at a level you never imagined you could be, because you cannot imagine until it starts to happen to you. And then pour yourself out in wisely guided, non-violent, sacred action in the name of justice. That's the plan.
I would like to go back to one thing you mentioned earlier, the fact that toward the end of your book, in your appendix, you have practices for navigating radical regeneration.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could spell out a couple of these that people could take home and start with just from hearing this lecture.
First, I do beg you to read the book. We spent 2 years boiling it down from 300 pages to 120 pages, so it can be a real map for you. Mark Twain said something that I found hilarious and very helpful. He said, I wrote you a 10-page letter because I didn't have time to write you a 5-page one. We took the time in our late 60s, my late 60s, and Carolyn Baker in her 70s, to boil down everything that we've been given to give to you. So please start with that. Secondly, look very carefully at the last sections of the book itself, which lay out a vision of how you can start immediately connecting with this transfiguration force. And the two main ways that we have discovered to be real ourselves, and at the heart of the mystical traditions, you'll discover them to be real also, is through what we call intimacy and cultivating nobility of soul. Intimacy comes from a marvelous phrase by Dogen, the great Japanese Zen Buddhist master, one of the very greatest mystics of humanity. And he said 3 words which have haunted me all my life. He said, enlightenment is intimacy. And you can meditate on those lines your whole life, but we've laid out the 9 kinds of intimacy that you can start working on tenderly from where you are right now. Intimacy with your sacred self, for example, intimacy with the divine, intimacy with your friends, taking friendship to another level of sacred power, intimacy with your pets, your animal companions, very precious to me because I live with a celestial divine cat who is my favorite being on the planet and gives me more joy and hope than is reasonable. Intimacy with the actual conditions of what people are going through, intimacy with justice, all of these intimacies you are already, I'm sure, partly in relationship with. Deepen them, and they will bring you into the unified field of your heart, mind, soul, and body. And then realize that at the core of all of the great prophets is a message about your and my inherent nobility. And nobility is a crucial word for me and for Carolyn. And for me, it comes from my passion for, believe it or not, Winston Churchill. My family was very devoted to Churchill, and I've had the honor of meeting Churchill's granddaughter and many people who knew him. And I've meditated deeply on why this extraordinary man was able to hold together a crumbling civilization that was facing a threat as great as ours, the threat of Nazism. And there's only one word that you can use when you come to face what Churchill was able to do in 1940, and that is nobility. He stood in the fiery, gorgeous center of himself, and he announced to the whole of England that they can fight us, they can invade us, and they can try and take us over, but we will fight them in the hills and the valleys and in the trenches, and we will never surrender. That's that radiant power that belongs to the divine prophets and the divine servants of divine love. And that's the core message of Jesus. That's the core message of the prophet, peace be upon him. That's the core message of all those who know that the human soul has to be fought for again and again with radical nobility. So the second thing that you can do is to really look at two things. First of all the ways in which you're encouraged by a materialist, consumerist, narcissistic society to be extremely unnoble, and realize what an attack on your divine reality that is. And secondly, you can, by looking at your own life and your own conscience and your own deep yearning, you can uncover that spark of nobility in yourself and realize that however it may have been clouded by an addiction to comfort, by the narcissism that is rampant everywhere, by a seduction into materialism, by a buying of the fundamentalism of scientists who reject their own conclusions in quantum physics, however it has been reduced, it is something that can never be taken away from you because it beats like a wild bird at the core of your heart. So those are the first two things that you can do. Read the book and really concentrate on those two passages, those two prescriptions, really, that we gave. As for practices, look, keep it simple. Keep it simple. What I have discovered, and I've been initiated into all of the major mystical traditions, and I have, through that marvelous grace, access to literally hundreds of astounding and gorgeous practices. But what I've discovered in my own life is that what you really need are two kinds of practice, and keep them both simple. You need a very calming practice, a practice that will steady you and ground you in the great peace, the shanti of the divine serenity. Because as things get worse, you're going to need that serenity like oxygen. And the practice that is traditionally the most powerful and that I find most powerful is imageless meditation. Just sit and watch your thoughts, however turbulent they are, and bear the discomfort of watching your thoughts and feeling them pierce you, but wait for the clouds to part and the sun of your essential serenity to come through so you can taste it and know it, your deepest reality. The second kind of practice that is absolutely essential is what I call hot practice, the practice of awakening and keeping vibrant and alive the passion, the sacred, noble passion of the Sacred Heart, the great passion practice. And again, the greatest practice I know is the practice of the name of God. This is what Kabir recommended. He was one of the world's greatest evolutionary pioneers. This is the practice of remembrance at the heart of Sufism. This is hesychasm. This is the practice of the Jesus prayer. And what most evolutionary mystics find is that simply by saying the name of God ceaselessly in the core of your heart will be kept alive and gorgeous and prodigal and extravagant and incisively visionary and practically noble through everything. This morning I woke up and turned on the TV and faced the full moral dereliction of what's unfolding before us, this idiotic impeachment trial, which is clearly not going to go anywhere unless Jesus himself and the prophet and all the angels decide to intervene, which is most unlikely. And that really shook me. I'm not unprepared for this, but it shook me, and I began to feel true. Why do I do this? Why do I even believe that radical regeneration is possible? But I know myself well enough now to know that that is an illusion. That's just my human self rebelling against what it has to face. So I said, I'm going for a walk and I'm going to take the name of God into the walk. And I walked for an hour and my consciousness was completely transformed by the power of the name. And I'm able to give to you what I'm giving to you now through that radiant, grace-filled power. So I'm not speaking of something that I read in a book. I'm speaking on practice, about practices that every evolutionary mystic in a crisis as extreme as this can rely on to provide the great peace and the great passion and the marriage of the two in the human divine focus.
Our time is coming to an end, but one last question I'd like to ask you is, as you know, we're doing this under the auspices of the Theosophical Society,
Absolutely.
which has its own tradition. And I'm wondering if you could relate your ideas and thoughts in this book and in your own teaching and practice to those of Theosophy.
Well, I think it's directly aligned with everything that I've read of Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant and the other great pioneers of Theosophy. Fundamentally, Theosophy was born in the 19th century as a radical response to the growing dehumanization of humanity. And what Blavatsky opened up with her crazy, gorgeous brilliance was a whole realm of guides that were now willing to help humanity birth another evolutionary level so that the devastating consequences of a rabid technologization and industrialization of humanity wouldn't destroy humanity. And that was taken up again by Annie Besant, who understood after the First World War just how endangered the whole human enterprise was. And in her own heroic way, really stood for the alternative of the birth of the divine human, which she expressed in her own unique, passionate, and India-inspired way. So there's nothing in what I'm saying that isn't directly aligned with the deepest visions and impulses of Theosophy. And I admire both Blavatsky and Besant and the other great Theosophists very deeply because they've opened up to so many people who would never have met it otherwise, how much help and grace is streaming towards us at this terrifyingly dangerous moment from the other realms, who know, as Blavatsky and Besant both make clear, two things, who know that we, if we follow our selfish false self, are bound to create an intolerable crisis. They already were seeing the beginnings of that. But also know, and this is a thrilling way to end our conversation, but also know that the whole universe is training its grace-filled, anxious eyes on us, and help is available from all of the realms of the helpers and the servants of God, which Theosophy has been very courageous in exploring, explaining, and opening up.
Well, that's excellent. This whole presentation was extremely powerful and moving and eloquent. And we are coming to the end of our hour. So I, again, want to thank you. Just again, Andrew's book is called Radical Regeneration. So thank you, Andrew. It's been a great pleasure and a great honor.